Welcome to the Rogue Reader podcast. My name is James, and I like reading Star Wars books.
My name's Priscilla, and I like books, but never have I ever read a Star Wars book.
Well, today we're not talking about a Star Wars book.
Oh,
So, I want to do something a little different, something that I probably should have been the first video I did. And I want to explain the different canons in Star Wars. So, like, what is Disney canon, what was before, and how that works. Because I shouldn't just assume people know how that works.
oh, so like a history lesson.
A little bit, yes.
Oh, back to school.
Back to school. So, just to make everything simple, anything that is before the Disney acquisition, that's officially known as Legends continuity or
What is
Legends canon.
acquisition?
Before Disney acquired the rights to Star Wars.
Why is it called acquisition?
That's the term.
What's the definition of acquisition?
Do you really not know?
I don't know anything.
Before
Acquired.
Disney, acquired the acquisition of, before that, it was called, it's everything before that is called Legends.
Remember, I'm the common person. So.
Okay, yes, you're right. After Disney bought Star Wars, that's what's current canon. That's what you would say is Disney canon. So, like, recently we did the courtship of Princess Leia, how Han and Leia got married. That was before the Disney acquisition. That's the Legends canon story of how they got together. Shortly, like the next video we do is going to be, we're going to cover The Princess and the Scoundrel, which is the Disney canon version of how they got together. Okay, with me so far?
I think I'm understanding. Just essentially, yeah, it's just
It's two different universes.
two different universes came together differently.
Exactly.
Apparently.
Okay, so just to give you a history, when Star Wars first launched, there were other things. There were comics, and like Marvel did comics. There was like the Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which I covered book they did in between the movies, but no one was really thinking about like continuity. It was just George's movies and whatever extra they did for like money. It didn't really start until Timothy Zahn released the Heir to the Empire book, or the first of the Thrawn trilogy, which was the first book to like really tackle what happened after the movies, and it was super successful. And suddenly the publishers were like, hey, we can make money off of these, and they started really pushing more books, more comics. The video games were always happening, but like just more of everything Star Wars. The early authors, they didn't have to follow each other. I remember one of the interview with Kevin J. Anderson. He was one of the early authors. He was told that there was this Dark Empire trilogy comic, but he doesn't really have to pay attention to that. And he was like, no, like we should pay attention. Him and the other early authors kind of got together and said, let's make everything make sense. Let's make sure it all takes place linear and we can follow each other. And maybe I write a story and you have a character that would work. I can continue it in my story, or I left a thread here that you can continue on. They kind of worked together on that, and they wanted to make sure that everything fit together in like a nice little timeline.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, from my recollection of how this all works, isn't there like a master Star Wars of like information too that like they have to reference to in order to understand that they're within timeline?
Yes. So that came a little bit later. So the authors were doing this themselves, and then eventually Lucas, like publishing or whatever, they hired this guy Leland Chee. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yes, I remember him. I've seen
Yeah,
him.
he was in charge of creating a database of all Star Wars stories, characters, like events that they can use to reference. It was called the Holocron. He was called the keeper of the Holocron. I did actually, my dream job growing up was to be that. I wanted to be the keeper of the Holocron. That sounded so cool. And even for years when I had this idea of doing this like podcast in my head before I knew how I was going to do it, I wanted to call it the Keeper's Apprentice. I wanted to be the Keeper's Apprentice. So, but anyways, something I want to clarify is that George Lucas, he approves all these stories at this point. Remember, this is all pre-Disney, but he was not beholding himself to those stories. So he would approve them, like the outlines and things, make sure they kind of fit, but he was not going to follow them for his own projects. He makes it very clear. He's like, you can find interviews where he's like, they do great work and all these other stories, but that's a separate universe. That's not mine. So he wasn't beholden to them, but they were definitely beholden to George Lucas. So as an example, before the prequels came out, the Jedi, they didn't know that the Jedi couldn't marry. So, Luke gets married. Other couple Jedi in the stories, they have families and things. Then the prequels come out and you find out, like they're not supposed to get married. And they just kind of had to explain it that Luke did things differently. Another big one is before we saw what the Clone Wars was, it was assumed that the clones were evil. They were the villains that were being fought. And that was referenced kind of vaguely in the books. All of a sudden the Clone Wars comes out and it's like, oh no, they were the good guys all along. George would take ideas he liked. So for example, Coruscant is from a book. He took that. He liked that. Or I think like the Jedi Ayla Sakura, she was from the comics and he brought her into live action. That was cool, but he would do that. But otherwise, the authors, they would be forced to change things if he changed things because, again, he was not beholding himself to them, but they were reliant on what his stories came out. So one of the early authors, I don't remember who, I saw this in an interview, it was probably Timothy Zahn or Kevin J. Anderson. They explained that because someone asked them if they were ever upset when things had to change because of stuff George Lucas did or whatever. And he said, like, no, we were never upset because we always knew that we were essentially playing in his driveway with his toys, but we knew at any moment he could take his truck and just run over all of it. They knew that going into it.
Yeah, that's a reality of when you work with a huge IP.
Oh, another example, Boba Fett was originally like, he was a journeyman protectorate. His name was Jaster Muriel before he became a bounty hunter. Then episode 2 came out. Oh no, he's the son of Jango Fett. He's a clone. They had to kind of retcon things. Now Jango was raised by Jaster Muriel. They had to like switch things up. Stuff like that can happen. When the Clone Wars 3D series came out, which was originally on Cartoon Network, I think that was pre-Disney.
Yes.
George Lucas, that messed with a lot of things. It was established that the original Clone Wars was pretty much charted through comics and books originally. And it was established that Anakin became a knight like right before episode 3 came out, very late. When they made the series, they changed it that he got knighted almost right away at the beginning of the war so they could give him Ahsoka as a Padawan. Certain characters are killed off in the show that were alive in books that took place after. Like things like that would happen. And things kind of got a little murky there. Fast forward to 2012, George officially sells Star Wars to Disney. And Disney says, they announce all the things. They announce they're going to make the new park, Galaxy's Edge. They're going to have new movies coming out. And they announce that they are not following any expanded stuff that came beforehand. The only things they're going to consider canon are the movies and the 3D Clone Wars show. That's it. And they're officially rebranding the old stuff Legends. So that was when it got the name. Before that, it was just known as the Star Wars Expanded Universe. Then Disney rebranded it as that's Star Wars Legends. That's what we're calling it. Now, a lot of people were... Well, I don't know how many, but there was definitely a vocal group of people that were upset that they were decanonizing all that stuff, as they called it. Which I understand, because you invest yourself in that world, and then suddenly it feels like they're saying it doesn't matter. But, I mean, in my opinion, what else could they do? Like, they're not going to make new movies and they would have to fit the movies in between, like, all these books that pretty much chartered everything already. And you would have to expect, it's a very niche Star Wars audience that reads these books. Most people don't care. So they would have to they would have to try to like fit it in, which would be complicated, or they would have had to have adapted some of the books. And I don't want an adaptation. I want new stuff. I'm okay with just rereading it. So I don't see, to me, that was the right call for them to do. I don't know, like, yeah, of course they're not going to follow all that stuff.
No, it's too much. And they're already doing pretty good with like a lot of their original content so far. Like, what's that one where the kids... A Skeleton Crew.
Skeleton Crew. Yeah.
Like a lot of people are liking that one, and The Mandalorian, that one was pretty good. So it's Book of Boba Fett. People don't really care for, I know, but still like a lot of the original stuff. And I know you've talked about it. Some of the original stuff they still reference like very niche things from the book. Still, at least references. So it's not like it's gone away.
No,
but they're adapting it, and they're allowed to take pieces. That just doesn't mean they're erased. Yeah,
they brought back Thrawn for Star Wars Rebels, and they brought back the original author, Timothy Zahn, to write new books for him. They treated old stuff very well. They could have just ignored it. They're re-releasing the old books under the Legends banner. They're re-releasing a lot of the old video games. Like, they're treating it well. It's also technically not dead. The Old Republic MMO is still alive and getting story updates. That's technically Star Wars Legends. It's technically not dead. It's getting new updates.
I'm glad to hear that.
I also think they gave it more validity by giving it the name Legends. They gave it an official name. In my opinion, that kind of makes it more valid. So, like, remember how I said that before George Lucas, he didn't care what happened in that stuff. And he could take stuff if he wanted to, but if he changed anything, all the other authors would have to adapt to it. That was not the case this time. Disney said right off the bat, everything we do is going to be part of one canon, and they actually brought they hired Leland Chi on along with was it Pablo Hidalgo, who writes a lot of the source books, and made them in charge of the Lucasfilm story group. And their job is basically to make sure everything fits in one canon, for any new authors and stories going on. So it wasn't like with George, like Disney is saying everything we do is canon, whether it's a book or comic, and we're going to try to make it all fit. So that's an advantage right there, which is nice. And it allows for some really cool stuff. So in The Mandalorian, well, in the in the Star Wars Aftermath trilogy, I think they were the first books Disney released following their buyout of it. Every chapter starts with a little like one-page short story, and they're all different, following different people and just what's going on after the movies. And each book will kind of continue their story, and you have to read all three to get the full kind of complete short story. One of those followed this guy named Cobb Vanth, who found Boba Fett's armor in the Dune Sea, and he uses it to become a sheriff of a small like town in Tatooine. Just this really small, very obscure thing. In The Mandalorian, when Din goes to Tatooine, Cobb Vanth is part of the episodes. He's there in the full Boba Fett armor. Like, we see him in live action. That's something you would never expect. It's a small detail that they brought into the show that you would never expect to see. In the book of Boba Fett, they brought in Black Chrysanthemum, who is like an evil Wookiee. He's from the Star Wars Dr. Aphra comics. And they brought him into live action in this show, and he looks exactly like he does in the comic. It's just little cool things like that you would never would never have happened probably under George Lucas, or not to that extent. Or he would have like changed it. He would have completely made the character different. He would do stuff like that too. Now, it's not perfect, and people do criticize too much harshly. Disney does definitely prioritize the story the writer wants to tell. So, for example, originally, the Clone Wars was canceled, and Dave Filoni, he knew how he wanted it to end. They made the Star Wars Ahsoka book, and that took place right after the Clone Wars, and it was the first glimpse we got into what happened at the very end. A couple years later, Disney approved him to make another final season and actually show the story. And when he did it, it conflicts with the book. Like, the broad strokes are there, but it's a bit different, and people were criticizing it, saying, I thought you wanted it all to be the same and stuff, but the broad strokes are there. It's still basically the same story. Time passed and he had new ideas and he just slightly changed it, which is fine. They also did that with the Star Wars Rebels character Kanan. They originally gave him a comic showing his origin and what happened to him during Order 66. Then, a couple years later, they do the Bad Batch and they actually show it in live action, and it plays out very differently than it did in that start of that comic. Again, the broad strokes are there, but it's different. But that's okay. Like, no canon is perfect. Definitely Legends was not perfect because of what George Lucas, would change things, or just because of all the different writers. Even the movies aren't perfect. Like Leia remembers her mother even though she's dead. General Grievous talks to Obi-Wan like they've never fought before, but you see them fight several times in the Clone Wars. Like, no canon is perfect. I don't think people should expect it to be. No. Just enjoy it. That's kind of the history of basically canon in Star Wars. So Disney canon and, Legends canon. Does that all make sense so far?
So far, yes.
Okay.
But it just makes sense. Like, also, as I'm wearing a Disney blanket, I do advocate that if you're going to take an intellectual property, there's no way you can make it perfect. So I'm very impressed that they're willing to say we are starting our own canon. I think that's the smartest way to go about look how big. And this isn't even your entire collection. Some of them are still in boxes, right?
They're in another shelf that I'm still like rereading or such. Yeah. And it's growing. I mean, this shelf up is all Legends, and then the bottom shelf and like this top one is Disney. So it's starting to grow.
Yeah, exactly.
And how many other properties do that? There's not many other licenses out there that would care whatsoever about whatever book or comic came out about it. They're like Disney is, at least they are like caring about it, even if they're not perfect the whole time.
If there's any Star Wars people that are just like so weird and they're just like, I hate Star Wars because it's with Disney, it's like, it's still Star Wars. They did a good job and they're implementing a bigger audience to enjoy it with you. That's how I take out of it.
Yeah, very true. They're bringing in a lot of new fans.
Yeah, it didn't die with the old fans. I'll say that.
No. And you bring up a good point where you say like you're potentially missing out. I mean, like the last part I want to cover is like basically why it shouldn't matter what is old canon, what's new canon. Obvious. I mean, the first, just to get the obvious out of the way, none of this is real anyways. So they're all made up stories for fun.
Yep. Just like those haters that hated Black Little Mermaid when mermaids aren't real.
And canon is always, nothing will ever stay canon forever. So if you're holding on to something because it's canon and you feel like it's ruined because it's gone, you're setting yourself up to be disappointed because nothing is going to be canon forever. There's nothing saying that something happens at Disney and all of a sudden they're in financial trouble and they have to sell off Star Wars to someone else.
Just
and then,
like they did with Marvel.
They didn't sell off Marvel.
Well, Marvel.
Oh, when they bought it from Fox.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you think this new, let's say a new company inherits Star Wars, you think they're going to want to follow all the stuff Disney did? No, they're going to want to do their own thing too. Or this seems like something that would absolutely never happen, like a law that could never be broken. But at some point, I bet you, even if it's far in the future, they're going to remake Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing is safe from being remade. And there's no way that that's not going to happen at some point where they're like, hey, let's remake it. So if you need to have some sort of requirement in your brain, in my opinion, the minimum requirement of something is it official? Is it officially licensed? That should be it. Even then, there's some cool fan stuff out there. If you like that, that's fine. But if you need to have something to make it official to you, don't make it be whether it's canon or not. Make it, is it officially a licensed product? Because that means it's official, whether it's, no matter what storyline or timeline it takes place in. I want to talk about a personal story I had that kind of showcases why I don't think people should be too caught up on it. So what you were saying about missing out. So my favorite Star Wars book series is the Republic Commando series. I like it because the author, she really defined what Mandalorian culture was. The idea that they are, they're kind of wiped out, so there's not many of them left. Their homeland is just basically like kind of farmland. They're Mandalore. They accept everyone. They don't care who you are, what race you are, gender, anything like that. They're totally accepting of everyone. And they're big on adoption because they have so many wars and they leave so many orphans. It's part of their culture to adopt them and make them part of it. So they're really big on adoption. Those books also did a really good job of making the clones individuals, showing them. And like, as the books start out, they're just like normal soldiers. But then as it goes on, they start to question, why am I not allowed to do this? Why don't I have these rights? Some of them start falling in love and they want to get married. And by the end, they're planning to leave and desert the Republic. Just as they're planning to do that, Order 66 happens and everything like goes to shit. But that was my favorite Star Wars book series for those reasons. She wrote 5 of them and she had planned to write 2 more. But remember what I said, George Lucas didn't care about that stuff. This was pre-Disney. So the Clone Wars was going on at the time, the 3D Clone Wars, and they introduced a Mandalore arc. And George Lucas completely changed the Mandalorians. Now their planet was all bombed out radiation. They only lived within a bubble. They were all human and they all looked the same. They all had like blonde hair and like they kind of have like a European look. They were all pacifists. They had no violence. And the only ones that were violent... The only ones that were violent were the Death Watch, which the Death Watch was part of the early continuity as like an evil group, but they were saying that those were the only evil armored ones. The rest of them were pacifists. Because of these changes he made, the book series got canceled. It never got finished. So I was pissed. And I was already not wanting to watch it at the time because I had, at that time in my life, I had the preconceived notion that any animated shows were for kids. And I can just dismiss that.
How old were you?
So I was around 17 years old, about 17, 18 when this happened.
Oh, so you're like an angsty 17-year-old, be like, the shows are for kids.
Yeah, this is for kids. But then they changed all that stuff. They got the book series canceled. And now I was like, I am boycotting this. I am never going to watch this. I will never forgive them for what they did. I was like super angry. The show eventually... it ended and it was canceled and Netflix got the exclusive rights and they were going to air a final season of unfinished episodes that never got released, just a couple follow-up. And I was like, okay, there's going to be a point where the books are going to start referencing this show. And at that point, I have to watch it just to see what I'm missing. And of course, that did happen. The Fate of the Jedi books were heavily reliant on a plot point in one of the episodes. So I said, all right, I'm going to watch the show. I had a notebook. I was going to take notes. These are the only episodes that are absolutely required watching or ones that I like. And that way, if I ever have to watch it again, I can just ignore everything else and just these.
Oh my God.
I know. So I'm doing this. And as the first couple seasons, I'm like writing down episodes and like, all right, these ones I can skip and whatever. And as the show went on, it was less and less I was writing down. And it got to the point where I wasn't writing everything down. I was hooked. And I was loving the show. The thing is, the show, I talk about how I love that the Republic Commando made the clones individuals. The show tackled those same themes. A lot of people who grew up with that show, some of their favorite characters are clones. They're not like the non-clones. They would like the clones as their favorite character. And there's an episode where one clone turns traitor because he feels like he doesn't have, what right does he have to just be a slave in this army? There's another episode where they find a deserted clone who has a wife and a family. And there's like a moral dilemma. Do I report him for deserting? So the show tackled those same themes. And it's a really good show. Like,
oh, I've caught glimpse of it, including like some episodes of Bad Batch, which I think don't care for as much, but
I don't care for it as much. Yeah, the Bad Batch. It's not a bad show. It's just not my personal favorite.
However, yes, they have tackling themes of like identity. Where are you from? If you don't feel like you're from this community, a lot of people can see themselves in those shows.
So it did good jobs, and there were good stories in there. And if I hadn't resolved myself to watch it, I would have missed out on some really good Star Wars.
I can see like all the energy like you put in trying to not like it.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy to hate. It takes a lot of energy to hate something. It's simpler to just be like, whatever. And that's what I am now. Now I don't care. If I don't like something, whatever. It's fine. There's going to be something else I'll like. If it contradicts things, nothing's going to prevent. Those books are still my favorite, and I will still watch the Clone Wars. It's not going to ruin my enjoyment of it. I love the Force Unleashed video game. I even have it with my movies up there. Like, that's how much I love it, because it shows the origins of the rebellion. Star Wars Rebels also does, and they're not compatible with each other at all. Star Wars Rebels is my favorite Star Wars show. I can still love both of them, even if they're different. I don't care anymore. It doesn't matter. Who cares? If you just like the stories you like. And it's interesting because when The Mandalorian came out, or actually when Star Wars Rebels, a certain season came out, they revealed that there are other Mandalorians out there. It wasn't just them. And they kind of brought back the old Mandalorians from those books that were set up. The Mandalorian show itself, they took things from her books. Like, Grogu, who he adopts as a foundling, that's the whole thing of adoption that Mandalorians are big on. They brought that whole theme back. So again, they're not opposed to taking old ideas and reusing them, and it all works out. That's basically everything I wanted to cover. Just the last thing I'll say is like what it means for this podcast or my channel. I'm going to cover both. I'm going to cover Legends and Disney canon. And I'm not going to use the words, this is canon and this is non-canon, because I think that's disrespectful to the older Legends canon. When I try to refer to things, I'm going to say this is Legends canon or this is Disney canon. I don't know the frequency of how often I'm going to cover the different types. There might be more Legends stuff just because it's been longer since I've read those. So it's more exciting to go back and read them versus the Disney stuff, which I've read more recently. But you never know. Like Andor's coming out, and I was thinking maybe I'll want to go look through some of the Rogue One tie-in books because that's coming out soon. So you never know. But I'm going to cover both. And yeah, that's everything I have to say. Enjoy what you enjoy, and if you don't enjoy it, that's fine. Just move on.
That's a good message.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode of the Rogue Reader podcast. May the Force be with you.
Bye.
Thank you for watching or listening to this episode of the Rogue Reader podcast. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, subscribe for more content, and share to any other Star Wars fans you think might also enjoy this content. Thank you very much.